Victor Monroe had built a life of luxury in New York City, where on a brisk evening the city buzzed with honking cars, flashing billboards, and bustling pedestrians. In his upscale penthouse overlooking Central Park, he relaxed in a leather armchair with a glass of whiskey in hand. A man of immense wealth and power, with a real estate empire to his name, he carried himself with a cool arrogance and firmly believed that money always mattered more than love. Claire, his wife, sat by the fireplace nervously twisting the hem of her dress. For days, she'd wanted to break the news that had weighed on her heart. But every time she met his cold, calculating gaze, she hesitated. Tonight, though, she couldn't wait any longer. Taking a steadying breath, she stepped forward and said, softly, "Victor, I have something important to tell you." He barely glanced up from his drink and replied in a flat tone, "Go ahead." Then, her voice trembling, she whispered, "I'm expecting." For a long moment, there was silence. Victor set his glass down and fixed his unreadable eyes on her. Instead of any sign of happiness, a mocking smile crept across his face as he repeated, "Expecting? And you expect me to believe this baby is mine?" Claire's heart sank as she protested, "Victor, of course it's mine. We've been married for 3 years. Why would I lie?" At that, Victor abruptly stood, his tall silhouette looming over her. "Don't act innocent, Claire. My mother warned me from the beginning about you," he sneered. "You always said my only interest was your money," Claire countered, tears welling in her eyes. "Your mother never liked me. She wanted you to marry someone from our own social circle. I loved you for who you were, not for your fortune." Victor laughed bitterly. "Love? Don't make me laugh. You think this baby will somehow keep you in my life? That you'll forever claim a part of my wealth?" Claire shook her head in disbelief. "I'm not after your money, Victor. I just wanted to share my happiness with you. I thought you'd be glad." Stepping closer until they were nearly face to face, he said harshly, "I don't trust you, Claire, and I won't let you trap me with a child." As she instinctively cradled her stomach, trying to shield the new life growing inside. "Her," she pleaded. "Victor, please don't do this. It's our baby." But his mind was made up. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a checkbook, scribbled a number and said, "Take this and leave. You'll never have to worry about money again." Staring in horror at the check, Claire whispered, "You really believe I can be bought? You think I'd trade our child for a piece of paper?" His expression hardened. "If you don't want the money, then take nothing at all. You're not staying here. Pack your things and get out." His words were final, and a cold shiver ran down her spine. In that moment, she realized the man she'd once loved was gone. Without another word, she turned and went to the bedroom, tears streaming as she hurriedly gathered a small bag. This had been her home, a place where dreams had once been built together, and now she was being tossed out like an unwanted stranger. At the door, Victor stood with his arms folded. "Don't ever come back," he said flatly. Claire looked at him once more, silently hoping to catch even a hint of remorse in his eyes, but found nothing. With a heavy heart, she left into the freezing night. With no family nearby, her relatives lived in Chicago, and no friends in New York, she wandered. The busy Manhattan streets where the neon lights and crowded sidewalks only deepened the emptiness inside her. Clutching her stomach, she whispered, "I'll take care of you, my baby, no matter what. I won't let you suffer." As the night wore on, reality sank in. She had no home, no money, and no one to turn to. Yet, beneath the despair, her determination grew. She vowed that no matter how cruel Victor had been, she would survive and raise her child with love, even if she had to do it all alone. Little did she know, 2 decades later, fate would lead her back to the man who had abandoned her. But this time, the roles would be reversed. In the days that followed, Claire trudged through the icy streets of New York, the sharp wind cutting through her thin coat. The towering skyscrapers that once symbolized hope and ambition now only reminded her of the life that had crumbled in just a few hours. The man she had trusted with her heart had tossed her aside without a second thought. Clinging protectively to her stomach, she knew she had to think clearly. She had to survive for the sake of her child. Eventually, Claire made her way to Grand Central Terminal and found a quiet bench. Exhausted from hours of wandering, she sat down as the busy travelers around her hurried on with their lives while hers had come to a standstill. She closed her eyes, attempting to drown out the clamor, but sleep eluded her. Hunger gnawed at her, a painful reminder that she hadn't eaten since the morning, and food required money, which she didn't have. By dawn, she realized that New York was too expensive to remain. Every street corner was a reminder of Victor. Needing a fresh start, she thought of an old college friend who lived in Chicago, Naomi, whose kind heart had always offered a ray of hope. With no other options, Claire made her way to the Port Authority bus terminal. At the counter, her hands trembled as she asked in a barely audible voice for a ticket to Chicago. When the clerk asked if she wanted a round trip, she murmured that one way was best. There was nothing left for her here. "That'll be $120, the clerk said, tapping on his screen. Her stomach sank. She had absolutely nothing. Setting aside her pride, she approached a middle-aged woman, asking if she could spare any money. The woman quickly looked away, mumbling an apology and walking off. Undeterred, Claire asked an elderly gentleman, a suited businessman, and even a young couple, but all she received were awkward looks and silent refusals. Just as she was about to give up, a tall, lean man with gentle eyes tapped her on the shoulder. "Hey, I'm from Chicago," he said kindly. "How much do you need?" Embarrassed, she replied, $120. Without a moment's hesitation, he pulled out his wallet and handed her exactly that amount. "I've been in your shoes," he said simply. "Just promise me you'll pay it forward when you can." Overwhelmed with gratitude, Claire promised, "I will. Thank you. You have no idea what this means to me." Within an hour, she was on the bus, watching New York vanish in the distance as the miles passed. Unsure of what awaited her in Chicago, whether Naomi would take her in or how she'd survive, she nonetheless felt a glimmer of hope for the first time since Victor's callous act. When the bus finally arrived in Chicago the following morning, a mix of nerves and cautious optimism filled her. She had memorized Naomi's old address from a faded holiday card, though she had no phone to call ahead. Stepping off the bus, Claire took a deep breath of the crisp air. Chicago felt different from New York, less polished, but somehow warmer. Hailing a cab with her last bit of money, she provided the address and watched as the car navigated the city streets. When they arrived at a modest apartment building in Lincoln Park, she hesitated. What if Naomi had moved? What if she didn't even remember her? Summoning her courage, Claire knocked on the door. Seconds stretched into what felt like an eternity before it finally swung open. Naomi's eyes widened in surprise as she saw Claire. "Oh my gosh, Claire!" Naomi gasped, tears welling in her eyes. "I didn't know where else to go." Without hesitation, Naomi pulled her into a warm embrace. "Come on in," she said firmly. The small apartment was cozy, filled with books, framed photos, and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee. Naomi guided Claire to a couch and wrapped a blanket around her. "Tell me everything," she urged gently. Claire, with worry etched on her face, began recounting everything. Victor's callous rejection, the unexpected pregnancy, and the shock of being cast out so abruptly. Naomi listened silently, her eyes burning with anger at the injustice. "You deserve so much better, Claire," she murmured. Wiping her tears, Claire admitted, "I don't know what to do. I have no job, no home, and I can't raise this baby on the streets." Naomi squeezed her hand. "You're not alone. You can stay here as long as you need, and we'll figure it out together." Over the coming weeks, Claire slowly adapted to her new life in Chicago. Naomi's apartment became her sanctuary, a safe haven where she could breathe without fear. Every morning she woke to the smell of coffee and the distant hum of the city, grateful for the comfort Naomi provided. Yet, despite this kindness, Claire knew she couldn't depend on Naomi forever. She had to stand on her own 2 feet, support herself, and prepare for her baby's arrival. With no savings and no college degree, her options were few. She spent her days wandering downtown, filling out job applications at cafes, diners, and retail shops. Rejection followed rejection, some polite, others curt, all dismissive. Still, she refused to give up. One afternoon, after endless hours of job hunting, Claire wandered into a small diner in River North. The aroma of grilled burgers and freshly baked pies filled the air, and a help wanted sign on the window caught her eye. Desperate, she stepped inside and approached the counter. A middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a weary expression looked up from cleaning a mug. "What can I get you?" the woman asked. "I saw your sign," Claire said nervously. "Are you still hiring?" The woman studied her for a moment. "Ever worked in a restaurant before?" Claire shook her head. "No, but I'm a fast learner. I really need this job." The woman sighed. "It's not easy work, and the pay isn't great. The customers can be tough. Think you can handle that?" Claire nodded eagerly. The woman, who introduced herself as Susan, handed her an apron and said, "You start tomorrow morning. Don't be late." Overcome with relief, Claire shared the news with Naomi that night. "See? You're already moving forward," Naomi said with a smile. The very next morning, Claire arrived early at the diner, determined to prove herself. The diner was modest, frequented by truckers, office workers, and locals who had been coming there for years. The work was hard, taking orders, refilling coffee cups, clearing tables. But for the first time in weeks, Claire felt a sense of purpose. Day by day, she saved every dollar she could by cutting back on expenses, eating only Naomi's home-cooked meals, and walking instead of taking the bus. Yet, even with this job, the challenges of pregnancy loomed large. Medical bills, diapers, clothes, and other necessities. One evening, after a grueling shift, she sat with Naomi at their small kitchen table and admitted, "I need to do more. This job just isn't enough." Naomi, who also graded papers for her teaching position, thoughtfully suggested, "Have you thought about taking night classes? Something that could lead to a better job?" Claire sighed. "I don't have the time or money for that." Naomi tapped her pen on the table and added, "What about community programs? There are organizations in the city that help single mothers with scholarships, job training, and more." The idea sparked hope in Claire. The next day, she visited the Chicago Women's Resource Center, where she met a friendly counselor named Deborah. After listening carefully to Claire's story, Deborah handed her a list of programs and reassured her, "You're not alone. People want to help." One program in particular caught Claire's eye, a short, affordable training course for medical office assistants that promised steady job prospects. Determined to secure a better future for her baby, she enrolled immediately. As the weeks passed, her belly grew along with her resolve. Balancing work, classes, and doctor visits wasn't easy, but every effort was for her child. Susan at the diner even began showing Claire extra kindness by occasionally slipping her extra food to take home, while Naomi remained her steadfast supporter. One evening, as Claire sat in her room folding hand-me-down baby clothes, she suddenly felt a soft flutter in her stomach. Freezing in place, she pressed a hand over the small bump and then felt another tiny kick. Tears filled her eyes as she whispered, "You're really here, aren't you?" In that moment, she felt an overwhelming connection with her baby, a love so strong it silenced all the pain inflicted by Victor's cruelty. Meanwhile, far away in New York, Victor Monroe continued living his life of luxury, oblivious to the woman he had discarded. His real estate empire had grown, with his name appearing in prestigious magazines and articles. Women came and went, none lasting long enough to leave a mark. Convinced he had done the right thing, he saw Claire as nothing more than a mistake, a problem he had neatly removed from his life. He never once wondered about the child he abandoned. Yet fate has a way of reuniting people. And Victor never imagined that 20 years later, Claire would reappear, not as the broken woman he had dismissed, but as someone far stronger than he could ever have imagined. Over the years in Chicago, Claire rebuilt her life. Months turned into years as she created a stable world not only for herself, but also for her son, Logan, who was born at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. From the moment she held him for the first time, tiny fingers wrapping around hers, Claire knew her purpose was greater than any pain Victor had caused her. The early years were the toughest. She worked long hours at the diner while finishing her training as a medical office assistant, and Naomi was always there to lend a hand. Some nights, exhaustion overwhelmed her, but the sight of Logan's sleepy smile made everything worthwhile. By the time Logan was 5, Claire had secured a full-time job at a pediatric clinic in Lincoln Park, leaving the diner behind. It wasn't a grand victory, but it meant she could finally afford a small, cozy 2-bedroom apartment in a safe neighborhood. Life was still challenging, but at least it was stable. Claire made sure Logan had everything he needed: books, warm, clothes, and even occasional treats. In those early days, she rarely thought of Victor. There were moments of anger and questions about whether he ever regretted his choices, but over time she realized that dwelling on him was pointless. He had chosen to cut her out of his life, and she had chosen to build a new one. Logan grew into a bright, compassionate boy, inheriting his mother's resilience and determination, though his sharp blue eyes hinted unmistakably at his father's features. Claire was always honest with him about his origins, that his father had left before he was born, and that he was a powerful businessman in New York. However, she never spoke with bitterness. "People make choices they can't undo," she would say. Logan, who adored his mother, never pressed for details about Victor. When he turned 18, he had become everything Claire had hoped for: a responsible, ambitious young man with a brilliant mind and a kind heart. His acceptance into Columbia University filled her with pride and fear. Letting him go was the hardest thing she'd ever done. On the day she dropped him off in New York, she hugged him tight and whispered, "Go make your mark on the world, my love." He promised to call every day, and as he merged with the crowd of students, she felt both the weight of her sacrifices and the beauty of what they had built together. Meanwhile, Victor Monroe's life took a different turn. His success in real estate had skyrocketed, making him one of New York's wealthiest men. Yet, his achievements came at a cost. Over the years, he had married twice, both marriages ending in bitter divorces. He had children from each union, but they barely spoke to him. His empire brought him wealth and fame, but no true happiness. He buried his past, convinced that what he did was necessary and that he had moved on, dismissing Claire as just another closed chapter. But fate had its own plans. One day, as Logan strolled through Manhattan, excited about his future, he stopped in front of a towering building bearing the sign, Monroe Enterprises. He had heard the name before from his mother. Curiosity sparked inside him, and for the first time, he felt a strong urge to learn more about the man who had abandoned them. With his heart racing, he pulled out his phone and searched for information. Articles painted a picture of a ruthless businessman admired for his wealth, but criticized for his lack of empathy. As Logan scrolled through images of Victor, he was overwhelmed with mixed emotions. This was the man who had chosen power over family, a man who had walked away without looking back. That evening, Logan called his mother. "Mom, do you ever wonder if he regrets it?" he asked softly. There was a pause on the other end before Claire answered. "Maybe, but I stopped wondering a long time ago." Logan was silent for a while. Though his mother had moved on, he still needed closure. He wasn't sure if he was looking for a confrontation, an apology, or merely an acknowledgement that he existed. Over the next several weeks, he researched everything about Victor. The more he discovered, the more conflicted he became. Stories of failed marriages, estranged children, and brutal business deals painted a picture of a man who had built an empire at a steep personal cost. One afternoon, while walking near Wall Street, Logan made a bold decision. He entered the towering Monroe Enterprises building, his heart pounding. A well-dressed receptionist in her 40s looked up and asked, "Do you have an appointment?" "No," Logan admitted, "but I need to see Mr. Monroe. It's important." The receptionist raised an eyebrow. "And who are you?" After a brief hesitation, Logan said, "I'm his son." The receptionist studied him for a long moment, her expression mixing skepticism with curiosity, as if trying to decide if this young man could be telling the truth. Logan felt a strange mix of emotions. He had walked in impulsively, without any plan, and now, declaring himself as Victor's son, it all felt shockingly real. Meanwhile, Victor, unaware that the past was about to catch up with him, sat in his glass tower. The receptionist then asked for identification. Logan fumbled out his driver's license. Glancing at it, the receptionist noted his last name, which he had from his mother, and then said, "Wait here," before disappearing through a sleek glass door. Alone in the grand lobby, surrounded by towering ceilings and carefully arranged art, Logan's heart pounded as he waited. Soon a tall security officer in a dark suit emerged. "Mr. Monroe will see you," he said in a firm but neutral voice, and led Logan through a maze of glass-walled offices and marble corridors. Finally, they reached a massive wooden door. The officer pushed it open to reveal an expansive office, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan. Behind a sleek black desk sat a man Logan had only seen in news clips and interviews, Victor Monroe. Victor looked up from his laptop, his piercing blue eyes narrowing as he observed Logan. Despite the years, there was a similarity in those eyes that Logan recognized in his own reflection. Victor's face now showed streaks of gray and lines from years of stress, yet he still exuded the same aura of power that had once made him a legend in business. For a long moment, he simply studied Logan, his expression unreadable. Then, in a voice that was sharp and detached, he asked, "Who are you?" Logan's stomach tightened, but he maintained his composure. "My name is Logan Carter," he said evenly, pausing before adding, "Your son." Victor's fingers, resting on the laptop, curled slightly as he spoke. "I don't have a son." Logan let out a bitter laugh. "I figured you'd say that," he replied, stepping closer. "You left my mother when she was expecting me. You threw her out like she was nothing, and she raised me on her own, working herself to the bone so I could have a chance at a decent life. And all this time you've been here, pretending we don't exist." Victor exhaled slowly as if gathering his thoughts. He stood and walked around his desk. Up close, Logan noticed a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. "Claire Carter," Victor muttered almost to himself. That was her name. He looked back at Logan, and for the first time, there was a hint of recognition, not just cold detachment. "She never tried to contact me," he added. Logan clenched his fists and fired back. "Then why would she? You made it clear she wasn't welcome. You kicked her out with nothing." Victor, rubbing his face, looked tired. More than just the exhaustion of business. It was deeper, heavier. "You shouldn't be here," he finally said. Logan's anger flared. "What? Because it's inconvenient for you? Because it messes up the perfect life you built?" he demanded. Shaking his head, Victor replied, "I didn't come here looking for money. I don't want anything from you. I just needed to see you to understand how a man can walk away from his own child and never look back." For a long moment, Victor was silent. Then his voice dropped. "You think it was easy?" You think I haven't thought about it? Logan stared at him in disbelief. If you did, you sure didn't do anything about it. Victor let out a bitter chuckle. What did you expect? I was young, ambitious, and not ready for fatherhood. He paused, then added, if I had reached out, if I'd tried to be a part of your life, would Claire have let me? Logan hesitated, knowing his mother had never wanted Victor back in their lives, yet that didn't excuse his actions. You never even tried, Logan said softly. That's the difference. Victor's eyes softened slightly. You're right. I didn't try. Logan took a deep breath. He had come searching for answers, and perhaps he'd found some, but not the ones he hoped for. His father wasn't a monster. He was simply a flawed, selfish man who made a choice long ago and never looked back. I don't know what I expected, Logan admitted, shaking his head. I guess I just needed to see it for myself. As he turned to leave, Victor spoke again. Logan. Logan froze, his hand still on the door handle. Victor paused briefly before asking, what does your mother think about you being here? Logan's grip tightened. He turned his head just enough to meet Victor's gaze and said, she doesn't know. I think she stopped caring about you long ago. With that, Victor walked away, leaving Logan standing alone in the vast office, staring out at a sunlight he'd never really seen before. Stepping out into the cool autumn air of Manhattan, Logan's mind whirled with emotions. The conversation with Victor had left him feeling hollow, as if he'd been chasing something that didn't exist. He had imagined this moment for years, the confrontation, the revelation, but reality was far less dramatic. His father wasn't some remorseless villain or a repentant man seeking forgiveness. He was simply a businessman who had made a decision and lived with it, with no apologies, no explanations, just a cold acceptance of the past. That indifference stung more than outright rejection, leaving Logan feeling lost. As he wandered the busy streets, the noise of taxis and chattering pedestrians blended into an endless background hum. His phone buzzed with messages from his mother, but he ignored them. He knew she was wondering why he hadn't called back. Uncertain how to explain, he eventually found refuge on a bench in Central Park, where the cool air, the scent of fallen leaves, and the sight of joggers in their own worlds offered a momentary escape. Thinking of his mother, the sacrifices she made working 2 jobs, missing every birthday, every school event, yet always being there when he needed her. Logan finally checked his messages. As expected, there were several missed calls and texts, including one that simply said, "Call me, it's important." With a sinking feeling in his stomach, he dialed her number. On the first ring, his mother answered. "Logan," she said, relief clear in her voice. "Where have you been? I've been trying to reach you all day." "Sorry, Mom," he replied, rubbing his forehead. "I just needed some time to think." After a brief pause, she asked gently, "Where are you?" "In the city," he admitted honestly, though unsure how much to reveal. After a moment of silence, she said, "You went to see him, didn't you?" Logan exhaled slowly. "Yes." A long silence followed until she softly added, "I thought you might eventually." Frowning, Logan asked, "You never reached out to him?" A quiet laugh escaped her. "No. I was young, heartbroken, and too proud to beg someone to love their own child. Honestly, I never wanted him in your life if he didn't want to be there. You deserve better, sweetheart." Logan's throat tightened. "You never told me much about him," he said. "All I knew was that he left. I didn't want you growing up hating him." "I made my choice, to make sure you never felt unwanted," she replied. "You were enough, Mom. That's all I ever wanted to hear." For the first time that day, Logan felt a sense of clarity. Perhaps he didn't need to confront Victor to find closure. The answers had been with him all along, in the love and strength his mother had always shown. After a long moment of reflection in the park, Logan said, "I'm coming home." His mother sighed in relief. "I'll be here." With one final deep breath, he headed to the subway. For years he had searched for justice, acknowledgement, even revenge. But in the end, none of that mattered. He never needed Victor Monroe, never had. And now he could finally start living the life he believed in. In the quiet of his small apartment in Brooklyn, Logan stared out at the city lights. The encounter with his father left a strange emptiness, as if his whole life had been nothing more than a minor footnote in Victor's story. He had spent years wondering what he did to make his father leave, blaming himself for not being worthy of love. Now he understood. Victor's absence was never about him at all. It was all about his father's own selfish choices. With that realization, Logan finally felt ready to stop the self-blame. He picked up his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he found his mother's number. Though they had already spoken after the meeting, he needed to hear her voice again. "Hey, Mom," he said softly when she answered, warmth flooding her tone. "I just wanted to check in." She chuckled lightly. "You don't have to worry about me. I'm the one who checks on you." Logan smiled. "I just wanted to hear your voice." Pausing as if sensing his inner weight, she asked, "Are you okay?" Leaning back on his couch, he admitted, "I thought meeting him would give me some closure, but it just feels empty." His mother sighed. "Closure doesn't come from others, it comes from within. Victor isn't going to give you what you need." Logan closed his eyes, letting her words sink in. "You were right about him, about everything," he said. After a pause, she whispered, "I never wanted to be right about this, sweetheart. I would have given anything for him to be the father you deserved." Logan's voice cracked. "You were enough, Mom. You always were." They talked for a while longer, sharing memories and laughter from his childhood. By the time they hung up, Logan felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. He hadn't found all the closure he sought, but he realized he was never truly alone. Chapter 3. The following days, Logan threw himself into work. As a financial analyst at a small firm, far from the power and wealth his father wielded, he was proud of what he had built on his own, without shortcuts or handouts. One afternoon, while grabbing coffee near Wall Street, he ran into an old college friend named Oliver. They hadn't spoken in years, but over coffee, Oliver mentioned a business opportunity, a startup looking for sharp minds like Logan's. At first, Logan hesitated. He had a steady job and income, but the excitement of building something from scratch was irresistible. After several restless nights weighing his options, he took the plunge. He quit his job and joined Oliver's startup, dedicating himself to long hours, endless meetings, and a fresh start defined by hard work. Months turned into a year, and the startup took off, securing funding and expanding rapidly. Logan built a reputation as a self-made man, not as Victor Monroe's son, but as someone who had earned his own success through determination. One evening, while preparing for an important investor meeting, Logan received an unexpected email from a journalist working on a feature about successful entrepreneurs with unique backgrounds. The email mentioned Victor Monroe, hinting at a connection. Logan's stomach twisted at the thought of his past being dragged into the spotlight. After staring at the screen for a long moment, he took a deep breath and replied simply, "I have no connection to Victor Monroe. My story is my own." For the first time in his life, he truly believed that. Logan had always thought that success would bring him peace. Once he built a life free of his father's shadow, he expected to feel whole. But even as his startup flourished and his name gained recognition in New York's financial circles, a quiet restlessness lingered within him. No amount of achievement could erase the years of abandonment, the sleepless nights his mother endured, or the decades of unanswered questions. Though he had fought hard to distance himself from Victor, his father's legacy still held sway over him. One evening, after a long meeting, Logan found himself wandering aimlessly through Central Park. The city lights danced through the trees as the crisp autumn air carried a hint of nostalgia. Debating whether to call his mother, he finally answered a call from an unknown number. Normally he would ignore such calls, but something compelled him to answer. "Hello?" he said cautiously. There was a pause, then a deep, familiar voice spoke. "Logan." His breath caught. He recognized that voice, now older and rougher, yet unmistakable. "Victor Monroe." Logan's grip tightened on the phone. "How did you get my number?" he asked. Victor sighed. "I have my ways. I thought it was time we talked." Logan let out a bitter laugh. "You figured after 20 years you'd just decide now is the right time?" Victor replied, "I know I don't deserve a warm welcome." There was another pause. "I saw an article about your company. You've done well for yourself," Victor added. Logan's jaw clenched. "I did it without you." After another pause, Victor added quietly, "Look, I'm not in the best shape these days, health-wise." Conflicting emotions surged through Logan. Part of him wanted to tell Victor he didn't care about his problems, but another part, still, searching for answers, couldn't ignore the weight in his father's voice. "What do you want?" Logan asked, his tone cool. "Just one conversation, that's all I'm asking," Victor replied. Every instinct in Logan screamed to walk away, to let the past remain buried. Yet there was something about Victor's tone that made him hesitate. "All right," Logan finally agreed. "One conversation, but I choose the place." Victor readily agreed, and they arranged to meet the next evening at a quiet restaurant in Manhattan. That night, Logan tossed and turned, questioning whether he was making a mistake. When morning arrived, he knew he had to follow through. The restaurant was nearly empty when he arrived. His nerves were on edge as he scanned the room until he saw Victor Monroe sitting in a corner. Victor looked different now. His once robust frame had thinned, his face lined with age, and something resembling regret. Logan sat across from him, keeping his expression neutral. After a deep breath, Victor began, "I've made many mistakes. I won't make excuses, but leaving you and your mother, that was the worst." Logan scoffed. "You don't get to say that. You had 20 years to fix it." Victor nodded slowly. "You're right. I don't expect forgiveness, but I do want to explain." Lowering his gaze, he continued, "When your mother got pregnant, I was terrified, not of being a dad, but of losing the life I'd built. I was selfish and thought I could erase my mistakes by running away." Logan's chest tightened. "You didn't just run. You destroyed us. My mother struggled for years while you lived in luxury." Victor replied quietly, "I know, and I've regretted it every single day. I tried to convince myself I was doing you a favor by staying away, that you'd be better off without me." Logan shook his head, his voice thick with frustration. "I didn't come here for money. I don't want anything from you. I just needed to see you face to face, to understand how a man can walk away from his own child and never look back." For a long moment, Victor was silent. Then he said in a low voice, "You think it was easy?" Turning toward the window, he added, "You think I haven't thought about it?" Logan stared at him, incredulous. "If you did, you sure didn't do anything about it." Victor let out a bitter chuckle. "What did you expect? I was young and not ready for fatherhood." He paused, then asked, "If I'd reached out, if I'd tried to be part of your life, would Claire have let me?" Logan hesitated, recalling that his mother had never wanted Victor back in their lives. "You never even tried," he said quietly. "That's the difference." Victor's expression softened for the first time, and he murmured, "You're right, I didn't." Logan exhaled deeply, realizing he had come seeking answers, though not the ones he wanted. His father wasn't a monster, just a flawed, selfish man who made a choice long ago. "I don't know what I expected," Logan said, shaking his head. "I guess I just needed to see it for myself." As he turned to leave, Victor called, "Logan!" He paused. Logan's hand still rested on the door handle. Victor hesitated before asking, "What does your mother think about you being here?" Logan's grip tightened as he met his father's gaze. "She doesn't know. I think she stopped caring about you long ago," he replied. With that, Victor turned away and walked out, leaving Logan alone in the office, staring at a sunlight he'd never known before. Outside, Logan stepped out of the towering Monroe Enterprises building into the cool autumn air of Manhattan, his mind swirling with conflicting feelings. The meeting had left him empty, as if he had been chasing something that wasn't there. For years, he'd imagined a dramatic confrontation with the man who abandoned him and his mother, but reality was far less theatrical. Victor wasn't a callous villain or a remorseful man begging for redemption. He was simply a businessman who had made a decision and lived with it, offering no apologies or explanations, just a cold acceptance of the past. That indifference stung more than outright rejection, leaving Logan feeling more isolated than ever. He wandered through busy streets as the noise of taxis and pedestrians blended into a constant hum. Though his phone buzzed with messages from his mother, he ignored them, knowing she would wonder why he hadn't called back. Eventually, he found a bench in Central Park, where the cool air and the scent of fallen leaves offered a moment of clarity. He thought about his mother, how she worked 2 jobs, missed countless events, yet was always there for him, and finally checked his messages. As expected, there were several missed calls and texts, including one that simply said, "Call me. It's important." With a sinking feeling, he dialed her number. On the first ring, his mother answered, "Logan, where have you been? I've been trying to reach you all day." "Sorry, Mom," he replied. "I just needed some time to think." After a pause, she gently asked, "Where are you?" "In the city," he admitted, unsure how much to share. After a moment, she said, "You went to see him, didn't you?" Logan exhaled slowly. "Yes." A long silence followed, and then she said softly, "I thought you might eventually." Frowning, he asked, "You never reached out to him?" She let out a quiet laugh. "No, I was young, heartbroken, and too proud to beg someone to love their own child. I never wanted him in your life if he didn't want to be there. You deserve better, sweetheart." Logan's voice cracked. "You never told me much about him. All I knew was that he left." "I didn't want you growing up with hate in your heart," she explained simply. "I made my choice, and I made mine, to ensure you never felt unwanted." Logan swallowed hard. "You were enough, Mom. That's all I ever needed to hear." For the first time that day, he felt a deep sense of clarity. Perhaps he didn't need to meet Victor after all. The answers were with him all along, in the strength and love his mother had always given him. After taking one last look around the park, he said, "I'm coming home." His mother sighed. In relief, "I'll be here." With one final deep breath, Logan headed for the subway. For years, he'd searched for justice, acknowledgement, maybe even revenge, but in the end, none of that mattered. He never needed Victor Monroe, not then, not now, and finally he could start living his life on his own terms. Back in his small New York apartment, Logan stared out at the city skyline through large windows. The meeting with his father had left him in turmoil, a mix of anger, confusion, and an undefinable ache. He had always thought that if he ever saw Victor again, he would only feel hatred. He had imagined the confrontation, standing tall, flaunting his achievements, and making his father regret abandoning them. But reality was far more complicated. His father was a dying man now, stripped of his arrogance and burdened by regret, and that changed everything. The following days were restless. Logan buried himself in work, attending meetings, handling investments, anything to keep his thoughts away from Victor. Yet no matter how hard he tried, the thought of his father's impending death lingered. His mother, Monica, called him, sensing something was off. She didn't know about the meeting, and Logan wasn't sure how to bring it up. She had already suffered enough, but a part of him needed her comforting voice, a reminder of the woman who had raised him without ever looking back. On the third night after meeting Victor, Logan found himself driving through Manhattan, his thoughts pulling him toward the hospital where Victor was receiving treatment. He wasn't entirely sure why he was going there, but something inside wouldn't let him stay away. When he arrived, he found Victor in a small hospital room, sitting up in bed. His once strong frame now looked fragile, and his eyes, though tired, lit up with surprise at seeing Logan. "I didn't think you'd come back," Victor admitted, his voice raspier than before. Logan hesitated before stepping inside. "I'm not sure why I did," he confessed. Victor motioned to a chair beside his bed, and after a long, heavy silence, Logan sat down. The room was filled with unspoken questions until Logan finally said, "Tell me everything." For the first time, Victor spoke honestly about his childhood in a world where money meant power and emotions were seen as a weakness, about how he met Monica and loved her in his own selfish way, but was too afraid to risk his carefully built life. He admitted that when Claire told him she was pregnant, he panicked and convinced himself that leaving was the only option, that being a father would ruin his empire. Deep down, however, he knew the truth. He had abandoned them out of fear, not necessity. As Logan listened, a storm of emotions roiled within him. For years he had believed his father never cared, but now he saw a man broken long before he was even born. Despite his lingering anger, Logan couldn't ignore the pain in Victor's voice. "I don't expect you to forgive me," Victor finally said, his voice trembling. "I just couldn't leave this world without you knowing how sorry I am." Logan swallowed hard. He had waited years for this apology, and though it couldn't undo the past or erase what his mother had suffered, perhaps it could help him move forward without the heavy burden of resentment. In the weeks that followed, Logan visited Victor more often. Their conversations grew deeper as they discussed business, life, and the years lost. It wasn't easy and certainly wasn't perfect, but it was something meaningful. Monica was hesitant when Logan told her about these meetings, but she trusted his choices. One evening, as Logan sat by Victor's hospital bed, the older man looked at him with tired but peaceful eyes. "I never got to be your father," he said softly. "But in these last few weeks, you've given me a chance to be something close." Logan felt a tightness in his chest. He had never called him Dad, and probably never would. But at that moment, he reached out and squeezed Victor's hand, the closest he could come to forgiveness. Victor Monroe passed away 2 days later. In his will, he left everything to Logan, not just his wealth, but his personal journals and unsent letters, fragments of a man Logan had never truly known. At first, Logan wasn't sure what to do with it all. But over time, as he read through the pages, he began to understand his father in ways he never had before. Months later, while standing in his office overlooking the city he had built his life in, Logan realized something important. He had spent years chasing success to prove that he didn't need his father, but now, for the first time, he wasn't running anymore. He was moving forward, not in defiance of his past, but in acceptance of it.